Are we in danger? Is there an existential threat coming for our safety in the near future? These are the questions that some players have been asking themselves more and more often as they have noticed some worrying trends in Mythic Plus recently. And by recently we mean after the series of balance tuning passes that Blizzard had, which continued to buff this spec after it had fell out after a series of previous much harsher nerfs. Who are we talking about? Well, of course, we are talking about Augmentation Evoker, the spec which since its release has been overall the most popular and the most meta spec in this game. That's right, this is not an excessive statement. This is for example, the meta of Mythic Plus back in the better days when augmentation didn't exist. Preservation used to be the quite good one but for like 3 to 4 months, and then it fell off forever. After them though, there was the introduction of augmentation. That kind of speaks for itself. Devastation even thought they had a chance for a while. Nope, it's just all Aug. Blizzard didn't seem to have a problem with Aug for approximately like 6 months until they started a round of nerfs. However, these round of nerfs did not last very much towards the end of Dragonflight, as augmentation just continued back into the meta in Dragonflight Season 4 as well. And then you enter the War Within, where Season 1, again, augmentation was mega meta. No other spec in the game pretty much spent 3 out of the 4 seasons of its existence, even now 3 out of the 4.5 seasons of their existence to be very meta. Now, what is the danger in question? The danger, right now seems, a bit of an overreaction, because the danger is that augmentation here did not exist, and now there is a 2%. You can even see it, visualized when in previous weeks, of course, augmentation was practically doing not even viable damage for even lower keys. And then after the series of buffs it received, peaking at the last week's round of buffs, another like 5 to 6% buff in single target and near 10+% buff in AoE, now it became almost somewhat kind of looking like a real spec. Even if you look at the thrust players had in the spec, you had 79 Augs in week 4, and you had some 59 Augs in week 6. In week 10 you had 1,800. So it gives you the picture of the trust players are now putting in augmentation, thinking that the spec could now be back. You can even see it pictured, for example, in the overall points in Mythic Plus in the past couple of weeks. Augmentation is inexplicably now much high up. You also have a better, more dramatic picture if you look at the entire tier. That's how far augmentation was considered all the way back down in March. And then after the continuous buffs it received, it started joining the bottom of the other DPS instead of being practically non-existent. And then until very recently, you saw augmentation, this time going actually much higher up. Now, the current reality though, the current situation, if you look at other sites, for example, like WoW Meta, augmentation still doesn't seem to be registered whatsoever. Even if you look at the points, the top logs, for example, in Mythic Plus, there is still no sign of any augmentations. If you were, for example, to put the entirety of Evoker up for a challenge and see who were the more present ones in IKEs, it is starting to get quite the challenge between Aug and Dev, for example, right? Something that we couldn't have imagined even just a few weeks ago. And even in the average ratings right now, for example, in Mythic Plus, you do see that once you go towards the high key level, now, dangerously enough, the Aug players are finding themselves in the 6th higher average ranking spec for score in Mythic Plus, passing Devastation Evoker. Now, of course, many of these Aug players are simply dev players who respect to Aug, so it's not that they gain this score from 0, they simply had it high already because they were dev players, but it does show that after a certain point, a bunch of dev players quit dev to go for Aug and then gain more score. So it is quite indicative of the current thrust players have put in augmentation, despite now looking very small. You can see, for example, that dev before was higher up, and then after a while Aug has passed devastation. Now, the question here is, of course, is this actually changing what's been going down in Mythic Plus? Something we have been covering week by week, which is why also we haven't put that much attention recently, because as you see yourself, players in the past couple of weeks went to sleep, basically. They know that turbo boost was about to happen, so no point in pushing keys, for example, since you're about to gain a lot of power from the turbo boost week. Also, none of them, major participation points we could have talked about were changing, so it was still Disc, Vengeance, Unholy, Balance, and Arcane, without really noticing any other major change in Mythic Plus. However, besides, of course, the one change being now Augmentation. Now, what is the situation right now for this spec in Mythic Plus, and how much of a chance there is for this spec to, continue to become more and more popular over time? Are we going to get, basically the question is, are we going to have another one of these Dragonflight seasons where Augmentation was giga nerfed? We thought it was over, it was done, we'd seen Augmentation around, and then it was just a big no. A big troll, never mind, Augmentation is still very much alive. So, the situation at the moment with Augmentation playing really just Scale Commander as their strongest build. The current situation is that their damage is now pretty good. Of course, the reason why you see them having so much damage, even in a log where you see the attributed extra damage to the other specs from Augmentation, is the fact that now the base damage belonging to an Augmentation Evoker has gotten higher and higher and higher every time, since the buffs that Augmentation provides, namely Ebon Might and even the burst of damage of Breath of Eons, have been nerfed and nerfed and nerfed over time, but their base damage, their direct personal damage has been buffed more and more and more, down to the point of making them more like a traditional DPS spec over the first support spec in the game, basically. The main thing to take away, however, from the current situation of Augmentation is that they are, better now in single target, even between their Mythic Plus and single target build in the raid. However, despite that, they are still significantly behind the expected damage compared to a Devastation Evoker. We're still talking about almost 20% less damage than a Devastation Evoker. On 8 targets, for example, they can push 11, 12 million even DPS in Mythic Plus, which is still below what a Devastation Evoker can reach. Obviously, they still have their utility buffs, their defensive buffs, for example, they can give to players. So, of course, there is some hidden value you can give to Augmentation over other specs and also over Devastation. One of the definite benefits you can give your average Augmentation Evoker is the fact that their stats are somewhat similar to a Devastation Evoker. For example, it's going to be very easy for you to jump in the raid and to go from haste, mastery, and a good amount of crit as an Augmentation Evoker to a haste, crit, and a good amount of mastery that a Devastation Evoker was going for. Between being able to recraft your necklace, if you crafted it, your ring, if you crafted it, your secondary stat by playing the mini game of using your Sorcerer's Circlet and manipulating your highest secondary stats so that the Sorcerer's Circlet will use that, as well as your flask. It's very easy to change gear set, basically, from Augmentation to Devastation Evoker. So, for example, for many Devastation Evokers, it will be quite simple to jump into Augmentation with a pretty good gear set. So, with the good value you can find as an Augmentation Evoker with haste, crit, and mastery, it's very easy to itemize for the spec. One of the, if we can say, major weaknesses still of this spec in Mythic Plus, since we're wondering why would you replace one of the, for example, already existing meta specs for an Augmentation Evoker, is their significant lack of prio damage. This is something we have mentioned at length as to why, for example, many of the mages, down to the point where most of the mages now are arcane, right? The reason why arcane became more and more in vogue over fire mage, to the point where now the majority of mages are arcane, is not just because of their higher overall damage now after the buffs, but also because of their ability to use their funnel and their prior damage in Arcane Barrage to do higher damage to the more dangerous targets. We can do the same old experiment by looking, for example, at the first mega pull and looking at the DPS. Of course, Arcane cannot beat whichever spec is popping all of their cooldowns. In the case of DK, they didn't have their Blood Beast, so their damage was lacking here. But if you look at the damage done to the main HP chunky guy and see who did the most, then unsurprisingly, of course, it was Arcane. The one who is in charge of shaving down the HP of the biggest HP mob. Because ideally, in a perfect world, any Mythic Plus pack, you want to have all of the mobs die together, rather than taking 5 seconds to kill 8 different mobs and then be left for 20 seconds slapping a single target mob because he was still at 50% HP once your AoE was done. That's what Arcane helps you doing in Mythic Plus. This is something that, for example, Augmentation has really no power in doing with their damage. They don't really have any main powerful prior damage to speak of. They also don't really have any meaningful funnel damage, extra resources gained by hitting more and more targets to be able to increase their damage on their primary target. So replacing the Arcane Mage basically would be a no-no. You would have to between the two now have to change either Unholy or Balance for Augmentation. So we can say that right now there are little chances for Augmentation to actually continue this rise and continue this popularity over time, to go above other specs and become even more meta than what we have already seen in here, the rise they have been having in terms of score, even in high keys. We can definitely point out to the excitement, of course, of more nostalgic Aug players who now flocked back to Aug after the buffs and tried Augmentation again, because now it's at least playable compared to before. It wasn't just, weaker, it was just like doing much worse than it is now. There is still little chance that they will be able to pass one of the other two specs. We have already pointed out it's practically impossible to replace Arcane Mage because of the type of damage profile they have, which Aug completely lacks. They do something that specs like Unholy and Balance are already doing very, very well instead. So the problem would be, can Augmentation surpass one of these two? And right now, the answer is no. The only hope, which to many other players would be the only nightmare if Augmentation had a chance to become way more meta, would be if we kept growing our average key level to a point where it really becomes the most important thing to stay alive rather than doing more and more AoE damage. Now, if that is ever the case, then we might start to see some, what's that, dark green color in the top highest keys run, because Augmentation, even with all of the nerfs given to their survivability buffs they can give to players, it is still much more defensive and tanky in how much it can help the rest of the group, compared, for example, to a Balanced Druid with their Verse buff, their Mark of the Wild, pretty much the only thing they can give out, or Unholy DK, which is pretty much just AMZ if they run it, or even their own AMS to cheese some mechanics. Augmentation can do better than that. After all, for example, you can see all of these, for example, Dark Flame Cleft, the easier dungeon right now being cleared. You can see now that these are being cleared with 5.5 minutes under. 5.5 minutes, 3.5, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes 40. Plenty of time, plenty of DPS over the limit. Even here, Mother Load, it's like 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Even if we go back to different, harder keys, which have not been cleared nearly as high, like Mother Load, 5 minutes under the timer. Finding for different keys, like searching for something like Floodgate. Floodgate was 3.5 minutes under the timer. Rookery was 3 minutes under the timer. So clearly, for now, at least at this key level, 19s and 20s, we don't have a damage problem. So only if we were to keep going higher and higher and the timer would not be a problem, but rather being able to survive mechanics would become a problem, then maybe you might start to see more augmentation evokers. But for now, even after these buffs, and even after the excitement of many Aug mains going back to play the spec in Mythic Plus, we can still say that the danger is for now avoided. We are still in the clear of the terror of the possibility of Augmentation Evoker becoming at least very meta again. It might become one of these ret-like, ret-tier alternatives for now at best. Definitely not in charge of rising to the point of passing Unholy and Balance right now. So that's the current situation of the buffed augmentation when it comes to Mythic Plus. They might have actually more chances, as we mentioned, their single target, and more chances in the raid to see them grow more in that department compared to Mythic Plus for now. If you were wondering if you were already terrorized by the possibility of augmentation becoming again what they were just a few weeks ago, remember, this is not a lot of weeks, right? So it wasn't that long ago that this was the trend in Mythic Plus. But for now, this is definitely way out in the future if it ever happens. We are not near this level of threat from augmentation in Mythic Plus. So I hope this has reassured some of the players, already getting some flashes of PTSD about what could possibly happen in Mythic Plus with seeing maybe some streamers, maybe some players noticing more augmentations recently. It's still not a clear danger for now. Hoping this has helped some players calm down. We can now leave each other on this Thursday. So we're starting the goodbyes, of course, by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, I know, it's late. Unfortunately, I went to sleep, and we had a bunch of drills and machinery and pouncing on the walls that kept me awake all the time, and I had to go to sleep again in the afternoon, and now this is the result.